Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into a story that has mostly been forgotten in the history books, but is shrouded in mystery and chilling details. Picture New York City, its streets buzzing with activity, the hustle and bustle of daily life. But on a certain cold morning, something entirely different began to unfold. A sickness one that would nearly wipe out the city began to creep through its heart. People had no idea what was coming, no idea that their lives were about to be changed forever. You probably won't survive this, so brace yourself. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from, so post your location and local time in the comments below. Let's connect across the miles. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. New York City, 1876. It wasn't just another day in the metropolis. The streets were alive with the usual hum of carriages and pedestrians going about their business. But something was off. People had begun to feel a strange sense of unease. At first, it was subtle, just a few whispers here and there, about strange symptoms that seemed to be spreading among the population. It started with a few people coming down with fever. Then came the headaches. And next, a dry, hacking cough that would echo through the streets. But as the days wore on, the sickness began to spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. It wasn't just one neighborhood, it was everywhere, and it didn't seem to be stopping. The sick were falling into delirium, with many of them seeing strange, distorted visions while they laid in their beds. Some described strange figures standing at the edge of their rooms or shadows moving when no one was there. These stories began to spread like wildfire, fueling an already tense atmosphere in the city. No one knew what was happening, but they could feel it, a creeping, suffocating dread settling over the streets. Doctors were at a loss. No one had seen anything like this before, and the more they tried to treat it, the more it spread. The sickness was ruthless, claiming the lives of the city's most vulnerable. The newspapers, for the first time in decades, stopped printing their usual fare. Instead, headlines screamed about the epidemic that no one had anticipated. There were no vaccines, no treatments, just more bodies piling up in homes, in the streets, and in the makeshift hospitals that had popped up everywhere. And the most unsettling part? No one knew how to stop it. Historians still argue whether this was the result of a natural outbreak or whether something more sinister was at play. Was this simply a plague of nature, or was it a man-made disaster? Some even believed that it was a curse, an invisible hand of fate sweeping through the city. It felt like something far beyond human control. In those early days, the city's response was chaotic. There was no one to lead the way, no one to truly coordinate the efforts. The public health systems were overwhelmed. It wasn't just the hospitals that couldn't cope, it was everything. The city's infrastructure was breaking down. People were afraid to leave their homes, and as the sickness spread, the very concept of what New York represented, this vibrant, bustling city of opportunities, began to crumble. So many people were taken ill in a matter of days. Families, entire neighborhoods were being wiped out in the blink of an eye. But strangely, the illness did not discriminate. It wasn't just the poor or the weak, it affected the richest, the healthiest, the most influential citizens too. No one was safe. At first, authorities tried to downplay the severity of the situation. They didn't want to panic the people, but the numbers kept rising, and soon it was too much to ignore. The hospitals were overflowing, and the death toll climbed rapidly. Some people just vanished from the streets overnight, never to be heard from again, the eerie part. As quickly as the disease had started, it seemed to vanish just as mysteriously. One day, it was everywhere, and the next, it was gone almost like it had never existed at all. But the aftermath was chilling. Those who had survived were left with more questions than answers. What had really happened? Why had this plague been forgotten by history? No one knew. It was in the wake of this mysterious plague that the city began to unravel in unexpected ways. Once the illness had left the streets, the eerie calm that followed was just as unsettling as the chaos itself. People didn't talk about it. The sickness, this plague, was quickly swept under the rug as if it had never existed. But the survivors, the few that had managed to get through it, weren't so quick to forget. You're probably wondering why this plague, this disaster, has largely faded from the public consciousness. Well, historians still argue whether it was a case of deliberate suppression, or if it was simply the fog of time that caused it to slip through the cracks of history. The truth, it seems, was too terrifying to confront, and so the story faded away just like so many others from those dark days. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In the days following the worst of the plague, strange occurrences began to surface. It wasn't just the physical toll that the sickness had left on the city, but something more. The sickness, though it left the bodies of the living untouched, seemed to haunt the very land upon which the city had been built. The very air itself felt heavy, as if it carried the residue of what had been. What's curious, though, is how the survivors of the plague began to react. They weren't just affected physically by the sickness, they were changed mentally. People spoke of dreams they couldn't shake, of shadows that followed them through the streets, even in broad daylight. It was as if something had seeped into their very souls, something intangible and terrifying. But it wasn't just the survivors who felt the after-effects. New Yorkers in general began to grow fearful. Businesses that had once been open 24 hours a day began to close early. People avoided each other in the streets, never making eye contact, always with a sense of unease. It was a fear that couldn't be explained, a fear that had settled deep in the bones of the city. Some believed that the sickness had unlocked something else, something beyond the physical realm. Stories began circulating of strange happenings, lights flickering in homes that had been abandoned for months, whispers in the wind, and the odd sensation of being watched when no one was around. The question everyone seemed to be asking was the plague merely the result of bad luck, or was it something more sinister? Had it been intentionally unleashed, or was it just nature's cruel twist? Historians still argue whether the plague was an isolated incident or whether it was merely the beginning of something larger, something that perhaps New York was never meant to see. Some believe that the plague was an experiment gone wrong, that it was part of a larger, government-sponsored study in biological warfare. While there's no concrete evidence to support this, it's a theory that refuses to go away. The idea that it wasn't just a random event, but something planned, something engineered, leaves a lingering, unsettling thought in your mind. Others, however, say that it was purely a natural occurrence, an outbreak that wasn't predicted but had every chance of happening given the conditions of the time. But the stories that started to emerge after the plague had left its mark didn't feel natural. There was something about them, something too disturbing for words. It was as if the city itself had been touched by something unholy. The streets, the buildings, the very air the city of New York seemed to carry the weight of what had happened. Even the sound of the wind felt wrong, as if it was carrying with it the whispers of the lost souls who hadn't survived. It was a city that had been through something, a city that had seen too much. For those who had survived the plague, there was no going back to the normal lives they once knew. There were lingering memories of darkened rooms, the faint smell of death in the air, the sound of coughing echoing in the streets, and the faces of loved ones slipping away. It was a trauma that didn't heal. It was as if the plague had left an imprint on their very psyche, a scar that would never fade. As much as they tried to return to normal, New York City had been irrevocably changed. People walked the streets with a sense of wariness, as if expecting something to happen, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. And maybe it was that constant undercurrent of fear that kept the plague's story buried. Perhaps the city didn't want to face what it had been through, and so it buried the truth, hoping it would never resurface. But you can only bury a secret for so long. Eventually the truth comes out, and the more the survivors tried to forget, the more they remembered. And the more they remembered, the more the city seemed to remember, too. Despite the city's best efforts to bury the truth, the remnants of the plague, the whispers, the eerie happenings, and the strange apparitions that had begun to haunt New York could not be completely suppressed. The past, after all, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. No matter how deep you bury it, no matter how much you try to forget, it always finds its way back, often when you least expect it. As time went on, the memories of the plague became like an old, dusty photograph tucked away in a forgotten corner. It wasn't talked about, but it was still there, hanging in the background of New York's consciousness. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normality. The city, despite the trauma it had endured, moved on. But the survivors, those few who had lived through the plague, were never the same. It wasn't just the physical toll that had left its mark. The psychological scars ran deep. Many of the survivors found it hard to even speak about what they had experienced. It was as though the plague had left a stain on their very souls, something they couldn't wash off, no matter how hard they tried. And it wasn't just the survivors. Those who had lost loved ones were haunted by the empty spaces in their lives, the gaps that could never be filled. They didn't just mourn the dead, they mourned the loss of something greater, something that the city had once been. As more time passed, the strange occurrences continued, albeit more sporadically. The city was far from normal, though. People began to notice odd changes, unexplained disappearances, rumors of people going missing, never to return. And even more unsettling were the stories of people who would appear to be normal one day, only to suddenly snap and act completely out of character. Some began to believe that those who had survived the plague weren't entirely themselves anymore. They had been touched by something that had seeped into their very essence. The city's relationship with death became warped. People no longer feared it as they once had. Instead, they grew accustomed to it, as though it was an old friend that could return at any time. A walking ghost that you could never quite escape. The plague had, in a way, taught them to live in its shadow, and perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all. But it wasn't just the survivors who were affected. The city, as a whole, seemed to change. Its very heartbeat had slowed, its rhythm disrupted by the plague. The bustling streets, once alive with energy, now felt like empty corridors. People moved through them as if they were ghosts, floating through a world that no longer made sense. The life of New York City had been altered, perhaps forever. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the whispers began again. New Yorkers, despite their best efforts to move on, could feel it. The plague hadn't left. It had simply been lying dormant, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It was in the shadows of the alleys, in the corners of the subway stations, in the forgotten buildings that no one dared to enter. It was everywhere, yet nowhere at all. And some people, those who had lived through the worst of it, started to hear the whispers once again. They spoke of something else, something even darker than the plague itself. A force that had been unleashed, something that had followed them back from the brink of death. Perhaps it was this lingering presence, this unspoken truth that caused New York to become the city it was in the years that followed, forever caught in the web of what it had survived. Never fully able to escape the shadows of its past. Historians still argue whether it was the trauma of the plague that caused such strange happenings, or if something more had been awakened in the city, a darker force that was never truly vanquished. Some suggest that there is a connection between the plague and the city's rise to power. Perhaps it was a catalyst. Something that pushed New York into a new era, one that was irrevocably altered by the horrors it had faced. Others believe that the plague was merely a precursor to something worse, that New York had yet to see the full extent of its punishment. As the years passed, the plague became a part of New York's history, its legacy woven into the city's fabric. It wasn't just a chapter in a history book, it was a living, breathing part of the city's identity. And though most had forgotten the details, something deep within the city and its people had never truly let go. New York, the city that never sleeps, had learned to live with its ghosts. But those ghosts, unlike the ones you might expect, weren't just the lingering memories of those who died during the plague. No, these ghosts were something else entirely. They were the echoes of a time long past, a time when the city had been at its darkest, its most vulnerable. And in some ways, they were more real than any physical being. For the survivors, the memories of the plague never truly faded. There were days when they couldn't escape the feeling that the city itself was watching them, waiting for them to slip back into the grip of whatever force had claimed it so many years ago. There were nights when the shadows felt too heavy, the air too thick, as if the world was pressing down on them in a way that no one could explain. But the thing about New York is that, despite all its dark secrets, its people are resilient. They've lived through wars, plagues, and countless other tragedies. But what made this plague different, what made it so unsettling, was how it seemed to leave its mark on everything it touched. The city, for all its vibrancy, had become a place of duality, alive with energy, but haunted by the memory of what it had endured. Some began to say that the plague had, in fact, changed the very fabric of New York itself. The city's energy, its frenetic pace, had always been part of its identity, but now it felt different. It was as if something had shifted, a new rhythm had been established, one that was darker, more foreboding. The once bright lights of Times Square now seemed dimmer, the streets less welcoming, and the voices in the crowd a little more hollow. You might think that after so many years, the people of New York would have put the past behind them. But that's not how things work in a city like this. New York is a place that thrives on its history, its stories, its legends, and the ghosts that linger in its alleys and skyscrapers. The plague, it seemed, had become just another story to tell, but one that was told in whispers in the dark, corners of bars and cafes where the city's residents would gather to share their fears and their memories of a time when the world felt like it was slipping away. Even now, long after the plague has passed into history, you can still feel its presence. It lingers in the air, in the cracks of the sidewalks, in the sound of the wind that sweeps through the empty streets at night. You can hear the faint echoes of it if you listen closely enough, soft whispers, the sound of something moving just out of sight, the feeling that you're not quite alone. Some say that the plague left something behind. Not a disease, but a curse. Something that had been unleashed, something that couldn't be put back into the darkness from which it came. It was as though the plague had torn a hole in the fabric of reality itself, and whatever had slipped through was still here, still watching. You may laugh at the idea, dismiss it as superstition or paranoia, but as the years go on, the stories continue to circulate. And for those who lived through the plague, it's impossible to shake the feeling that something isn't right. That the city, for all its brilliance, is still holding its breath, waiting for something. Historians still argue about the origins of the plague, whether it was a natural disaster, an act of bioterrorism, or something far stranger. But no one can deny the impact it had. It reshaped the city in ways that no one could have predicted, and perhaps just maybe it changed the people who lived through it as well. Those who survived did not emerge from the experience the same. They were different, marked by something invisible, something intangible. And as the years go by, New York continues to stand, its skyscrapers towering over the streets like silent sentinels. The city hums with energy, its people bustling about, unaware or perhaps choosing to ignore the strange undercurrent that still runs beneath the surface. But if you listen carefully, you can hear it. It's the faintest of sounds, like the city itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something that will bring the past to life once again. Perhaps that's the most terrifying thing of all. Because no matter how much time passes, no matter how many years go by, the plague's shadow will always be there. It will always be a part of the city. And sometimes, just sometimes, it feels like it's waiting to return. As the years went by, the city continued to grow, to change, and to thrive. The plague, for most people, became a distant memory, a dark chapter of history best left forgotten. But for a few, especially those who had lived through it, it never truly left. They carried it with them, the weight of that invisible presence. The whispers, the shadows, the sense that something had shifted in the fabric of New York, these things never quite went away. Over time, the survivors began to move on. They built families, started new businesses, and tried to reclaim what they had lost, but the damage had already been done. The city that had once been the symbol of hope and prosperity now felt different. There was an undercurrent of fear, of unease that hung in the air like a fog that refused to lift. But the most chilling part of all was that it wasn't just the survivors who felt it. New York itself had been scarred by the plague. It wasn't just the people who had been affected, it was the city itself, the buildings, the streets, the very ground beneath their feet. There was something in the air, something that had changed after the plague passed, and though no one spoke of it, they all knew it was there. It was in the cracks in the sidewalk, in the creaking of the old buildings that seemed to sigh in the wind, in the faint smell of something rotten that lingered in the corners of alleys. It was in the way the streets sometimes felt just a little too quiet, just a little too still, as though the city was holding its breath. Historians still argue whether the plague was truly the cause of this change, or whether it was just the trauma of living through something so devastating. Some say that the city, in the wake of such horror, became haunted not just by the ghosts of the past, but by the very memory of what it had endured. And what's more disturbing is that, in the decades since, strange reports have begun to surface. People have spoken of shadows that move on their own, of cold spots in the middle of summer, of voices heard in the dead of night, in the old, forgotten parts of the city. Some say the plague never really left its presence still lingers, hidden in the cracks, waiting for the right moment to rise again. It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? That something so sinister could be waiting in the dark, in the quiet corners of the city, just biding its time until it's ready to strike again. Maybe that's why, despite everything, New Yorkers still feel it, the weight of something long gone but never truly forgotten. The city that had once been so alive, so full of energy, had been touched by something darker, something that refused to let go. In the years that followed, New York became a city of contradictions. It was alive with ambition, with hope, and yet it was haunted by its past. The plague had left its mark not just on the people who survived, but on the city itself. It had changed the way they viewed the world, the way they viewed their home. And yet, despite it all, New Yorkers are resilient. They carry on, they rebuild, they go about their daily lives, always aware that something lurks in the shadows. It's not a comforting thought, but it's the truth. In the back of their minds, they know that the plague might have been forgotten by most, but it hasn't been forgotten by the city. And maybe that's the scariest part of all that the city itself remembers. It remembers what happened, and it's waiting for something. It's hard to shake the feeling that, deep down, the city knows something we don't. It's as if it's been watching, waiting for the right time to remind us of what it has endured, and perhaps to show us that, in the end, it's never truly over. Maybe the plague was only the beginning, and maybe, just maybe, there's something else lurking beneath the surface, something even darker, something that the city is holding in its depths, waiting for the right time to reveal itself. For those who live through it, the fear never truly fades. It becomes a part of them, a part of the city's DNA. And as time goes on, the questions only grow. What really happened? What was the true origin of the plague? Was it simply a disease, or was it something far more sinister, something that has yet to fully reveal its terrible truth? And as long as those questions remain unanswered, the city will never be free from the shadow of what it survived. The memory of the plague will linger, like a ghost that refuses to rest, forever haunting the streets of New York. The decades passed, but the strange atmosphere around New York never completely dissipated. As the city grew and expanded, it carried the weight of its past with it, like an invisible anchor that tugged at the hearts of its residents. The plague, though largely forgotten by mainstream history, was still very much alive in the minds of those who had lived through it. And for those who hadn't, there was an unsettling sense that the city's true history was being kept hidden. The quiet whispers about the disease, the strange occurrences, and the ghostly sightings became part of New York's unofficial lore. Locals and tourists alike would occasionally hear about the plague, often dismissed as nothing more than a myth or a wild exaggeration of the past. Yet the survivors, the ones who had borne witness to the horror, still spoke of it in hushed tones, reluctant to fully open up, but never truly able to forget. Some of the older survivors started to return to the very places they had once fled from. They came back to the streets, to the buildings, as if they needed closure. But what they found there was not what they expected. The city had changed. There were new buildings, new people, new energy, but it felt the same. It still carried that strange weight, that sense of having been touched by something darker than just a disease. It was during this time that a few began to speculate about the cause of the plague, not just as a biological event, but as something more metaphysical. What if the sickness was a catalyst, a force that unlocked something within the city itself? Some said the plague had opened a door to a dimension not meant to be crossed, a thin veil between the living and the dead. Some even suggested that the plague had been an ancient curse, one that had been dormant for centuries, waiting for the right time to rise again. While no one could ever prove these theories, the idea that something supernatural had been unleashed became more plausible with each passing year. The haunted whispers, the unexplainable noises, and the eerie occurrences continued to occur at irregular intervals. More and more people, particularly those who had been in the older parts of the city, began to report strange experiences, moments where time seemed to slow down, where the very air felt thick with something unseen. People who lived in buildings that had been there since the plague struck began to hear voices in the middle of the night. Some heard the sound of children crying. Others reported hearing muffled conversations that stopped when they entered a room. And then there were those who claimed they felt the presence of someone or something following them, always just out of sight. And yet, the city still moved forward. People were still getting on subways, still rushing through Times Square, still living their lives as if nothing had changed. But for those who knew the truth, the city's vibrant energy was always overshadowed by the haunting presence of its past. There were those who tried to trace the origins of the plague, combing through old medical records, talking to the descendants of survivors, and sifting through long-forgotten newspapers. What they found was chilling. The story of the plague had been systematically erased, buried under layers of official reports and sanitized histories. There were no detailed records of what had happened during those terrible months, no clear explanation of how the disease had spread so rapidly or why it had so suddenly vanished. Historians still debate whether the plague was deliberately forgotten or if it was simply lost in the tides of time. Some suggest that the city, in its fear and trauma, decided it was better to leave the story behind. Others claim that there were forces at play, perhaps the government, perhaps the city's elite who didn't want the truth to come to light. After all, if the plague had been caused by something beyond human control, something supernatural, it would have posed questions that no one was ready to answer. As the years went on and the city continued to flourish, a strange thing happened. The stories of the plague, though buried, never truly disappeared. They began to resurface in new ways. Movies were made, books were written, and documentaries were filmed, most of them based on what little was known, and filled with theories, some plausible, others not so much. But all of them shared one thing in common: the belief that New York had, at some point, suffered an event so horrific that its effects could still be felt in the air. But the truth was never fully uncovered. The people of New York continued to live, but they also continued to live in the shadow of what had happened. And in a way, that was the most unsettling part. The city had survived, but it had also changed in ways that no one could fully comprehend. The plague was gone, but the fear it left behind was not. It lingered like a thick fog that couldn't be cleared, haunting the hearts and minds of the people who called New York home. And as time passed, more and more people began to realize that maybe, just maybe, the plague was never really gone. Perhaps it was always waiting, always watching. And when the time is right, it might return as quietly and as mysteriously as it once did, to remind the world of what New York had survived and what it might still be hiding. As the years passed, New York, much like the memories of the plague, was forced to adapt to its haunted reality. It was a city that had been touched by something far beyond human comprehension, and while most of the population chose to move forward, there was always that nagging feeling that something was waiting in the wings. The survivors, now elderly, continued to live their lives, but they always carried the weight of that unspoken truth. They had seen it, they had lived through it, and no matter how many years passed, the shadows of those memories would never leave them. What was particularly unsettling, though, was how the city seemed to react to these memories. New York had always been a city of reinvention, rising from the ashes of its past and pushing forward, always moving ahead. But there was something different about how the city responded after the plague. The city's very soul had been affected. The energy that had once been vibrant, frenetic, and ever constant had been dulled, and an unspoken anxiety began to permeate the streets. Perhaps it was the sheer number of survivors who couldn't escape the trauma. Perhaps it was the eerie quiet that settled over the city in those moments of stillness when nothing moved, and only the wind spoke its secrets. People had begun to feel as though they were being watched. There was a lingering unease, a sensation that never fully disappeared. It was as though the city had learned to live with its ghosts, but also learned to fear them. In recent years, stories about the plague had started to resurface. These weren't the sanitized versions taught in schools, the ones that downplayed the horrors of the disease. These were the stories from the survivors, the ones who had seen the true face of terror. They spoke in hushed tones, in darkened corners, as though afraid the very act of speaking about it would bring the plague back to life. It was those stories that made people uneasy, that sent shivers down the spines of those who had no real knowledge of what had happened. The first-hand accounts of strange occurrences during the plague years, strange sightings, whispered voices in the night, and the inexplicable feeling that something terrible had been unleashed on the city. But the most unsettling part wasn't the stories themselves, it was the sense that they were true. In the quietest moments of the night, when the city slowed to a near standstill, there were still whispers of the plague. People, especially those who lived in the older parts of the city, would tell you about the dreams they had. The ones where they walked through an eerily empty New York, a city that felt alive in a way they couldn't quite understand. It was the same city, yet it felt foreign, as though it had been distorted, transformed by some outside force. In these dreams, the streets were empty, but you could feel the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching you. The buildings towered overhead, but there was something wrong about them, something off. And then, just as you would reach the heart of the city, a sensation of dread would overtake you. The dream would shift, and you would feel a cold hand on your shoulder, or hear your name whispered from the darkness. There were others, however, who didn't see the dream as a mere product of fear. They believed it was a warning that the plague hadn't really ended, that the forces behind it were still there, waiting, biding their time. They believed that the plague had unlocked something that should never have been touched, and that it was still there, beneath the surface, just waiting for the right moment to return. Historians still argue whether these experiences are the result of collective trauma, or if they might, in fact, be rooted in something deeper. Some suggest that the memories of the plague have become so ingrained in the city's collective consciousness that they manifest as ghostly images and eerie sensations. But others, those who live through it, are convinced that it's something more than just trauma. They believe that the city, with all its history, with all its darkness, holds a secret that it will never fully reveal. And as the city continues to grow, as the skyline stretches ever upward, the question remains, what really happened during the plague? What did New York experience, and why has it been hidden from history? More importantly, what is still lurking in the shadows of this great city, waiting for its time to strike again? It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? That something so vast, so powerful, could be lying dormant, just beneath the surface. That the plague wasn't just a disease, it was the beginning of something far more sinister. And when the time is right, it might rise again, just as silently, just as mysteriously as it did all those years ago. Maybe New York's true history will never be fully revealed. Maybe the city will always carry this dark, unspoken secret. But one thing is for certain, the memory of the plague will never truly fade. It is a part of New York's soul now, intertwined with the city's very identity. And whether it's in the whispers of the old buildings, the quiet corners of forgotten streets, or in the dreams of the survivors, it will always be there waiting. As the years turned into decades, New York became something else entirely. A city known for its resilience, its ability to bounce back, now carried the heavy, unspoken weight of the plague in its bones. It wasn't just the survivors who lived with the shadow of what had happened. It was the entire city. The architecture, the streets, the very air, all seemed to have absorbed the trauma in a way that no one could fully understand. It was as if the plague had seeped into the foundations of the city, altering its very essence. And while life continued, the stories, the strange occurrences, and the eerie sensations persisted. It wasn't just the older buildings that seemed to hold memories of the past, it was the people too. The ones who had lived through it, and the ones who had inherited the stories. New Yorkers, once tough and unshakable, began to speak in hushed tones about the city's darker history. For some, it was a curiosity, something that gave the city a layer of mystique, but for others, it was an unsettling truth that refused to be ignored. By now, most of the survivors were elderly. their faces etched with the lines of time. Yet, even in their old age, they couldn't escape the lingering effects of the plague. They spoke of dreams, disturbing dreams that took them back to the days when the city was ravaged by illness. In these dreams, they would wander the streets of New York only to find them empty, as though the city had been abandoned. But in the distance, they could always hear something footsteps, the sound of something moving in the shadows. The stories varied. Some said they saw figures moving through the fog, figures that were never fully visible, but who seemed to follow them wherever they went. Others spoke of voices, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, calling their names in the dead of night. The common thread was the feeling of being watched, of being followed by something that could never be fully understood. But it wasn't just the survivors who felt it. People who lived in the older parts of the city, particularly near the areas where the plague had hit hardest, began to report similar occurrences. Strange dreams, strange sights, things that felt out of place, things that couldn't be explained. It was as if the plague had left behind an imprint on the city, one that could never be erased, no matter how hard people tried to move on. There were rumors that the city's very foundations had been altered by the plague. Some said that the old parts of New York, the ones closest to where the disease had hit, were somehow cursed. There were stories of people who claimed to hear faint screams at night, or of buildings that seemed to breathe, their walls creaking as if they were alive. Some even went so far as to say that the plague hadn't just affected the people, it had infected the land itself. Historians still debate whether the plague was just a terrible tragedy or whether it was the result of something more supernatural. Some believe that it was simply a natural disaster, a horrific event that no one could have predicted. Others, however, argue that it was something darker, something that had been unleashed by the plague. Perhaps, they suggest, it was a curse or maybe something more insidious, something that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for the right time to make its presence known. Whatever the truth may be, one thing was certain: the plague had left its mark on New York, a mark that could never be erased. The stories, the strange occurrences, the feelings of unease, they all pointed to one undeniable truth: New York had been changed by the plague. And though the disease itself was gone, its effects would linger for as long as the city stood. But even with all the stories, all the rumors, there were still those who believed that the city would eventually recover. They believed that time would heal the wounds of the past, that the ghosts of the plague would fade into the background, just another part of New York's history. But as the years went on, that belief seemed more and more like a distant dream. The shadows never fully receded. The unease, the sense of something lurking just beneath the surface, remained. Perhaps that was the true legacy of the plague, the idea that New York had never truly healed. It had survived, yes, but it had been irrevocably changed. The city that had once stood as a symbol of hope, of progress, had been touched by something darker, something that no one fully understood. And in the end, that darkness would always be a part of it, a part of its history, a part of its soul. As New York pressed forward, its relentless pace continued to define the city. Yet, despite its outward appearance of resilience, a quiet fear lingered beneath the surface. There was a growing sense that New York's history had never been fully reconciled. The plague, what it had done to the city, and what it had left behind was something people couldn't forget, no matter how hard they tried. And though the streets buzzed with activity once more, the city was never quite the same. The most unsettling thing about the aftermath of the plague was the way it had wormed its way into the very fabric of the city. The survivors, the ones who had witnessed the horrors firsthand, carried the weight of their experiences with them. They might have gone about their lives, but their eyes always seemed to dart toward the shadows, as if expecting something to appear from them at any moment. They'd grown accustomed to the feeling of being watched, to the sensation that something or someone was always just out of sight, following them, waiting. And it wasn't just the survivors. People who had moved to New York after the plague, those who didn't live through the worst of it, began to feel it too. It was subtle at first. The occasional inexplicable chill, the way a building might seem to sigh in the wind, or how the night would fall just a little too quickly, as if the sun had decided to set earlier than usual. These feelings began to grow more common, and soon more and more people began to talk about the strange occurrences that plagued the city. There were reports of footsteps echoing in the streets at night, of lights flickering in places they shouldn't, and of faces seen in the corners of rooms that no one could explain. But what was more disturbing was that these reports weren't isolated incidents. They were happening all over the city, sometimes in the oldest buildings, but also in the shiny new high-rises that were supposed to represent New York's future. It seemed that no matter how much the city had grown, no matter how many new buildings had been erected, the shadow of the plague would never fully leave. It was as if the plague had left behind an energy, a pulse, embedded in the very structure of the city, and that pulse was beginning to stir again. Some people began to speculate that the city's rise to greatness after the plague was more than just the result of resilience. What if, they whispered, the plague had unlocked something in the city's soul, something ancient and powerful? What if New York had always been a place of hidden forces, of dark powers that had been awakened by the horrors it had faced? This idea seemed almost too ridiculous to entertain, yet it lingered in the back of the minds of those who couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was not quite right. Historians and urban explorers alike began to seek out the forgotten parts of the city, the old neighborhoods, the abandoned buildings, the subway tunnels long closed off to the public. They found things, strange things. Crumbled walls that seemed to hum with energy, ancient graffiti on the brick walls that no one could decipher, and remnants of a time long past. Some of them swore they saw fleeting figures, shadows that darted just beyond their sight. Others heard whispers, faint voices calling from dark corners just out of reach. For some, these discoveries were merely the results of overactive imaginations. But for others, it was proof of something far darker. They began to speculate that the plague had left behind more than just death. It had left behind a part of itself, a piece of the darkness that had once consumed the city. And now, that darkness was stirring once more. And then there were the dreams. These were the most disturbing of all. People who had never experienced the plague, who had no direct connection to its horrors, began to dream of it. These were not just ordinary nightmares. They were vivid, disturbing dreams where they wandered the empty streets of New York, hearing the faint cries of the sick and dying. They could see the disease, feel the fear in the air, and hear the whispers of the past. The most chilling part of these dreams was the sensation that the plague wasn't just a memory, it was alive. It was waiting just beneath the surface of the city, ready to return. The feeling that something ancient and powerful was watching, waiting to rise again, haunted the dreams of those who had never even heard of the plague. It's hard to say why the city seemed so haunted by its past. Maybe it was the trauma, the collective grief of those who had lived through it. Maybe it was the sense of guilt that they had allowed something so horrific to happen, and that they had never truly confronted it. Maybe, as some of the more conspiracy-minded individuals speculated, it was the city itself changed by the plague, altered by its touch, and now cursed to carry that darkness for as long as it stood. No one could say for sure. But one thing was certain, the plague, though it had come and gone, had left its mark. And that mark was not something that would fade with time. It was something that would linger, like the ghosts of the past, haunting New York for as long as the city existed. New York, with all its energy and its constant hum, had become a city haunted by its past in ways it couldn't escape. The plague that once ravaged its streets seemed to have left an indelible imprint, not just in the memories of the survivors, but in the very essence of the city itself. Despite its modern appearance, with its towering skyscrapers and the ceaseless rush of daily life, there was always something lingering beneath the surface. It was as if the city itself had become aware of its dark history, carrying it like a burden too heavy to shake. But what was most terrifying was that, as time went on, the presence of the plague's lingering curse, if you will, became less and less a thing of the past. It wasn't just a distant memory for those who had lived through it. For some, it began to feel like the plague was still there, watching, waiting, biding its time, as though it had never truly left the city at all. And this sensation was not just a figment of the imagination. Over the years, reports of strange happenings began to multiply. Stories from all corners of the city-old neighborhoods, New districts, even the pristine parts of Manhattan talked of inexplicable events, sounds that couldn't be explained and sights that didn't belong. People began to question, was the plague truly over, or had something far more sinister been unleashed? The stories that began to circulate were disturbingly similar. People spoke of seeing shadows moving in empty rooms, flickering lights, and a pervasive sense of being followed. But what set these occurrences apart was that they weren't just confined to one area of the city. They happened everywhere. In apartments, in offices, in subway stations, and in places where no one had expected anything strange to happen. The city, it seemed, was filled with these whispers, these tiny moments that defied logic. More troubling were the reports of people hearing strange, distorted voices. Some claimed they heard the voices of loved ones who had passed away during the plague. Others heard the voices of strangers, their words unintelligible but full of urgency and terror. The chilling part. The voices weren't coming from speakers, from radios, or from any devices. They were coming from the walls, from the shadows, from the air itself, and no one could figure out why. The problem was that these occurrences weren't just happening to a few isolated individuals. They were happening to large groups of people. Entire neighborhoods reported hearing whispers late at night. People felt cold spots in their homes for no reason. And some even swore they saw figures, faint, misty shapes that seemed to vanish when looked at directly. But the thing that unnerved most was the consistent feeling that something was just out of sight, something watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. For those who had experienced the plague firsthand, the sensation of being watched was all too familiar. The city, to them, had become a labyrinth of eerie quiet, a place where every corner held the potential for something unimaginable. And yet, despite the horror of the past, people continued to go about their lives. They had to. It was New York, after all. The city didn't stop for anyone or anything. It couldn't. But beneath the hustle and bustle, there was that constant, quiet fear, a fear of the unknown, a fear of what might still be lurking in the shadows. Some believed that the plague, in some twisted way, had been the catalyst for these strange happenings. Maybe, just maybe, the sickness hadn't been the end of something, it had been the beginning. The plague, for all its horrors, had opened a door that was never meant to be opened. It had unlocked something, an ancient presence that had been trapped for centuries, waiting for the right time to break free. Whether it was a curse, a supernatural force, or some unexplained anomaly in the fabric of reality itself, the plague had certainly left its mark on New York. But what was even more disturbing was the idea that it might not be over. That the city was still carrying the weight of something far darker than anyone could understand. Even the survivors, the elderly men and women who had lived through the worst of it, began to speak of it again. They hadn't forgotten. The plague had marked them in ways they couldn't describe, and the feeling of unease that lingered in the air seemed to remind them of something they had witnessed, something they could never unsee. Some whispered that New York would never be truly free of the plague's shadow, that the city had been changed by it in ways no one fully understood, that perhaps it was cursed forever, locked in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. The history books might have long since closed the chapter on the plague, but for those who lived through it, and for those who still felt its presence, the story was far from over. The idea that New York was somehow still haunted by the plague was not just a theory, it was a reality for those who felt it. They could feel it in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night when the city seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't always there, but there were times when it would resurface, like a shadow passing over the streets, a reminder that the plague, though long gone, had left something in its wake. Perhaps it was the trauma of the survivors, their inability to move on fully, that kept the plague alive in the city's psyche. Perhaps it was the sheer scale of the horror that had unfolded, an event so vast, so terrible, that no one could truly forget it. Whatever the cause, the feeling lingered. And for those who had lived through the plague, it was as if the city itself had been touched by something beyond understanding. The buildings, the streets, the very air, they all felt as though they were holding on to the past, unwilling to let it go. In recent years, some of the more curious souls, those who weren't too afraid to ask the difficult questions, began to dig deeper into the history of the plague. They sifted through old records, spoke to the last remaining survivors, and looked for clues that might reveal the truth about what had really happened. What they uncovered was unsettling. There were gaps in the records, holes in the story that couldn't be filled. The city's official response to the plague seemed strangely detached, almost as if someone had worked to erase the memories of it, to bury the truth so deeply that no one would ever be able to find it again. But for all their efforts, the survivors continued to tell their stories. They spoke of the things they had seen, of the way the city had changed, of the strange occurrences that followed in the wake of the plague. They spoke of the feeling that some force, some dark presence had never truly left. And though they didn't have all the answers, they knew one thing for sure: New York, in all its splendor and madness, had been marked by the plague in ways no one could ever explain. For some, these stories were simply a byproduct of the trauma they had endured, a way to cope with the unimaginable. But for others, they were a warning, a reminder that the past was never really gone, that history had a way of repeating itself, of rising from the shadows when it was least expected. There were those who believed that the city would one day be forced to confront the full truth of what had happened, that the plague, far from being a singular event, was just the beginning of something much darker, something still waiting to be unleashed. In the heart of New York, the old buildings still stood, their cracked facades whispering the stories of the past. The subway tunnels, once full of life and movement, now seemed more like forgotten passageways, full of the echoes of something lost. And though the streets were still crowded, still alive with the pulse of the city, there were moments when everything seemed to stop. The bustling crowds would fall silent for just a second, as if the city itself had paused, caught between the present and something far darker, something older. The feeling, for those who could sense it, was unmistakable. It was as if the plague was still there, lingering in the spaces between the people, in the empty corners of the city. It wasn't something you could touch, something you could see, but it was there, in the silence, in the whispers, in the shadows. It was the memory of something that could never be fully erased. And for those who had lived through it, it was a memory that refused to fade, no matter how much time passed. Some of the city's residents began to make connections between the plague and the strange occurrences that had been reported in recent years. They pointed to the old buildings, the abandoned hospitals, the forgotten parts of the city that seemed to be the epicenter of these strange events. It was as though the plague had left behind an energy, a presence that couldn't be wiped away by time or progress. Historians, of course, dismissed these theories as nothing more than the result of collective fear, of overactive imaginations. But for those who had lived through the plague, who had seen the aftermath with their own eyes, the truth was clear. The city had been changed, not just by the disease itself, but by the presence it had unleashed. And though the plague was gone, its effects would always linger. The most unsettling part of all was that no one could say for certain what the future held. No one knew if the plague would return, or if the city would ever fully rid itself of the darkness it had experienced. But there was one thing everyone agreed on: New York had survived, and in doing so, it had become something else. Something that, for better or for worse, carried the weight of its past with it. The plague, though it had come and gone, had left a mark on the city that no one would ever forget. As New York moved further into the 20th century, the shadow of the plague seemed to fade into the background of its busy streets. The city continued to evolve, each generation leaving its own mark on the metropolis. Skyscrapers rose higher, the subway expanded deeper into the earth, and the people of New York grew accustomed to the noise, the lights, and the ceaseless rhythm of life. Yet, despite all the outward signs of progress, something inside the city had changed forever. For those who had witnessed the worst of the plague, though, life never truly felt the same. They had seen what a city at the brink of destruction looked like, and they had survived it, but had taken something from them. They carried the weight of that trauma for the rest of their lives, hidden beneath the surface of their everyday existence. It wasn't just the memories of the sick or the bodies piling up in the streets, or the chaos that had taken over the city in the darkest days of the plague. It was the unshakable feeling that the city itself had been marked by something far darker, something that no one had ever fully understood. The survivors often said that it wasn't the disease that had changed New York, it was the fear. The plague had unleashed a deep-seated terror in the heart of the city, one that didn't just affect the physical world, but also the intangible. That fear was still there, beneath the surface, lurking in the shadows of the city's towering buildings and beneath the feet of its millions of residents. It was as though the plague had opened a door to something the city had never seen before. And while it had been forgotten by most, it still remained a part of New York's soul. But like all things, time has a way of smoothing over the rough edges of history. As the decades passed, fewer and fewer people remembered the plague, and fewer still talked about it. The horrors that once seemed so real were now just stories, whispered in the corners of bars or shared in hushed tones among those who had lived through it. The new generations, born long after the plague had come and gone, couldn't understand what it had been like. To them, it was just another tale from a forgotten past, another chapter in the city's long, complicated history. But even as the city moved on, there were still strange moments when the past seemed to surge back to the surface. Sometimes, late at night, when the streets were empty and the city was still, people would hear a sound, just a faint, distant echo of something. Some said it was the sound of footsteps in an empty alleyway or the rustling of wind through forgotten buildings. Others swore they heard soft whispers, as if the city itself was trying to speak. For those who lived through the plague, it was a reminder that the city, no matter how modern, how vibrant, how full of life, would always carry its past with it. The plague was buried in the city's bones, in the walls of its buildings, in the very air that people breathed. It was a part of New York, as much a part of the city's identity as its skyscrapers and yellow cabs. In fact, some even began to wonder if the plague was just the beginning. What if the city's transformation was not simply the result of time, but of something deeper, something that had been set into motion all those years ago? There were those who believed that the plague had done more than just ravage the city. It had unlocked something ancient, something far more powerful than a mere disease. A force that had remained hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. In the quiet corners of the city, there were whispers about it, about the things that could still be lurking in the darkness. People would speak of sightings, of strange occurrences, and of feelings that something had never truly been put to rest. Maybe it was the ghosts of those who had perished. Maybe it was something else, something darker, something tied to the very foundations of New York itself. It was as though the plague had created a scar, a wound that could never fully heal. And even though the world had moved on, even though the city had built itself back up from the ashes, that scar remained. It was a mark that no one could see but everyone could feel. And perhaps that was the true legacy of the plague, the understanding that, no matter how much time passed, New York could never truly escape what it had been through. In the end, it wasn't the disease that had changed New York, it was the fear, the terror that had lingered long after the plague was gone. The disease had only been the catalyst. The real change had come in the form of an unease that never quite dissipated. And maybe, just maybe, that was what had shaped the city into what it is today, a place that, no matter how lively or bustling, still carries with it the weight of its haunted past. And so, New York continues to stand, its skyline reaching ever higher, its streets always full of life. But beneath it all, deep in the city's bones, there remains the knowledge that the past is never truly gone. It may be buried, forgotten, but it waits, just beneath the surface, always ready to rise again. As the years turned into decades, New York's pulse continued to beat with the rhythm of modern life. The city became a symbol of resilience, an embodiment of strength, and a place where the future seemed boundless. Yet despite its external vitality, there was always a quiet undercurrent of unease. The memory of the plague, though forgotten by many, was still very much alive in the walls of the city. It lingered in the cracks of old buildings, in the deep shadows of alleyways, and in the collective psyche of those who had lived through it. What made this unease even more unsettling was that it wasn't just a lingering memory. It was a presence. The city had become a vessel for something that had been awakened during the plague. It wasn't just the remnants of the past, it was something else entirely, something that the city's residents, new and old, could never fully understand. It started with the whispers. At first, they were small passing mentions in the corner of a conversation, rumors shared between friends who had lived through the darkest days, but as time passed, those whispers grew. People began talking about the things they had experienced, things that couldn't be explained, things that felt wrong in the very fabric of New York. It wasn't just about strange occurrences. It was about the feeling of being watched, of being followed. People would say that it was the city itself that seemed to keep an eye on them, as though it had developed its own consciousness, its own memory. And the more people talked about it, the more these occurrences began to feel real. They weren't the product of collective hysteria or overactive imaginations. They were something more. And that was what frightened New Yorkers the most. This wasn't something they could just dismiss as a bad dream. This wasn't just a lingering fear from an old disease. It was something else. The plague had unlocked a door that the city could never fully close. It had touched something deep inside the heart of New York, and that thing was still there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting. For some, the idea that New York had been marked by the plague was simply a part of the city's history. It was just another chapter in a long and complicated story. But for others, the idea that the city's very soul had been altered was too real to ignore. They had seen it, the changes in the people, the atmosphere, the strange feeling that the city itself had become a vessel for something darker. Perhaps it was the trauma of the plague that had caused the city to carry this weight. Perhaps it was the fact that so many lives had been lost, and the city had never truly processed the pain, the suffering, and the grief. Perhaps it was the sheer horror of the disease, of the things that people had witnessed, that had left an imprint on the land itself. But whatever the cause, the result was the same. New York was no longer just a city. It was something more, something haunted, something altered by the plague's touch. The survivors of the plague were the ones who felt it the most. They had lived through it, and they knew the truth. They knew that the city had changed, that something deep inside it had been awakened. They could feel it in the air, in the streets, in the silence of the night. It was as if the plague had left a scar on New York, one that would never heal, no matter how much time passed. But even those who had not lived through the plague could sense it. They might not have been there when it happened, but they still felt the weight of it, felt the darkness that clung to the city. It was in the way the buildings seemed to sigh in the wind, in the way the streets sometimes fell eerily silent in the way. The light sometimes felt wrong, as if the sun itself had been altered by the events of the past. Some tried to explain it away. They claimed it was just the weight of history, the residue of the past seeping into the present. Others, more superstitious, whispered that the city was cursed, that it had been touched by forces beyond human understanding. Whatever the explanation, the feeling persisted. The plague had come and gone, but its presence remained. And then there were those who truly believed that the city was waiting for something. They believed that the plague had been only the beginning, that it had unleashed something far darker, something that had been dormant in the city for centuries. And perhaps, they said, that darkness was waiting for the right moment to rise again. They spoke of it in hushed tones, in the shadows of dark alleys and abandoned buildings, but they spoke of it all the same. It was as if New York itself had become a living entity, carrying the memory of its past and the promise of something yet to come, but no one could say for sure. All they knew was that New York was different. It had survived the plague, yes, but it had also been forever changed by it. And the more the city expanded, the more its population grew, the more it seemed that the shadow of the plague would always loom large over its future. No matter how many skyscrapers were built, no matter how many bright lights shone through the streets, New York would never be free from the past that had shaped it. And so, as the city continued to thrive and evolve, it remained caught between two worlds, one of the future, full of potential and promise, and one of the past, haunted by the dark history of what had come before. And in that tension, that unresolved conflict, the true essence of New York was born. New York's energy, its vibrancy, continued to pulse through the city streets as the years turned into the modern age. The city was forever changing, morphing into a skyline of glass and steel, with every new generation trying to leave its own mark. And yet, beneath the polished exterior, there was always a lingering sense of something unspoken, something not entirely of this world. The ghost of the plague was still there, never truly gone, its presence haunting the very heart of New York. The city had learned to live with it, to exist alongside this unshakable fear that simmered just below the surface. People walked the streets, went to work, celebrated their successes, and mourned their losses. But somewhere deep in their subconscious, the shadow of the plague lingered. They couldn't quite escape it. The city couldn't. It was bound to its past, shaped by it in ways that were not always visible, but always felt. And then, as time wore on, the stories began to change. What had once been whispered in the corners of old, dimly lit bars or between hushed conversations in the dark corners of a room became something else entirely. The memories of the plague began to take on a life of their own, fueled by the retelling of the few survivors who remained, and by the eerie occurrences that refused to be explained away. These stories started to spill out of the shadows, becoming something more than just fragments of a forgotten past. They became legends. Some said the plague had been nothing more than a disease, one that could be explained by biology, by science. But others, the ones who had witnessed its effects, who had felt its touch, swore that there was something far darker at play. They spoke of a force, an ancient, unseen presence that had been awakened in the wake of the plague. A force that had made the city its home, that had made the very air thick with tension, and that over the years had only grown stronger. The survivors spoke of it in fragmented stories, in disjointed memories. They spoke of dreams they couldn't shake, of things they saw but couldn't explain. They spoke of the way the city seemed to watch them, to listen to them as if it were alive, as if it had absorbed their fears, their grief, and their trauma. And though no one dared to say it out loud, those who had survived knew one thing for certain: the plague hadn't been the end of it. It had only been the beginning. The legends, the whispers, continued to spread. People spoke of the feeling of being followed, of shadows that never seemed to leave. They spoke of objects moving on their own, of whispers in the wind that carried voices from the past. It became clear that there was something more than just a disease that had ravaged the city. The plague had opened a door, one that had allowed something else to enter. And it wasn't finished yet. For the survivors, the truth was undeniable: New York was cursed. The plague, though it had passed, had unleashed something that would never truly leave. The city carried it, and so did the people who had lived through it. They were forever changed, their lives marked by something that no one else could see but everyone could feel. As the city moved forward, there were those who tried to forget, who tried to bury the past. But deep down, they knew it was there, waiting to rise again. The plague had left an indelible mark on New York, and that mark would never fade. It would never go away. It was part of the city's DNA, a part of its soul that could never be erased. And so, as the lights of New York continued to shine bright, as the streets remained bustling with life, there remained a sense of unease, of something unseen. The plague might have been forgotten by most, but for those who knew the truth, it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reassert its presence. New York had survived the plague, yes. But it had also been shaped by it, scarred by it, and haunted by it in ways that no one could fully comprehend. The city's resilience had allowed it to rise again, but in doing so, it had carried with it the darkness that had once nearly destroyed it. And for those who dared to look closer, to listen in the stillness of the night, the past was never truly gone. It was only waiting for the right moment to remind them of what had come before. The plague was never truly over. And as long as New York stood, it always would be a part of it, forever etched in the city's history. In its walls, in its very soul, waiting, watching, and perhaps one day it would return.